What does a mother cook when the paycheck disappears on Tuesday and payday is still 3 days away? In the barrios of San Antonio, El Paso, and East Los Angeles during the 1950s, Mexican families answered that question at every meal. A bag of dried pintos, a handful of chiles, and a stack of yesterday's tortillas could stretch further than anyone outside those kitchens would have believed. Number 17 kept a family of 8 going for days on pocket change. Number 9 turned a cut of beef that butchers practically gave away into one of the richest breakfasts across the Southwest. And number 3 used a part of the animal that most people would not even look at twice. These were not sad plates. They were built to keep working families on their feet. Hit subscribe, because here are 25 cheap meals Mexican families ate to survive the 1950s. Number 25. Calabaza con elote. Squash and corn simmered together in a clay pot with a little onion, garlic, and a dried chile for warmth. The squash was whatever grew in the yard or came cheap at the mercado, usually calabaza criolla with its thick orange flesh that fell apart after 20 minutes of cooking. The corn came straight off the cob, cut with a knife and scraped so the milky starch thickened the broth. In the colonias of the Rio Grande Valley during the 1950s, this was the meal families turned to when the pantry held almost nothing else. The sweetness of the corn against the soft, earthy squash made a bowl that tasted richer than what went into it. No meat, no stock, no dairy. Just 2 crops that had grown side by side in Mexican soil for thousands of years, still feeding people the same way they always had. Number 24. Tortillas con manteca y sal. A warm corn tortilla smeared with a thin layer of lard and sprinkled with coarse salt. That was an afternoon meal for children who came home from school across Mexican neighborhoods in Texas and California. The tortilla was made fresh that morning, and the lard came from the same tin that served every cooking purpose in the house. No protein, no vegetable, just the tortilla, the fat, and the salt. The combination of rendered pork fat on hand-patted masa carried enough calories to bridge the gap between breakfast and a late supper. Mothers handed these out to keep children fed until the real dinner was ready. In some families, this was all there was between sunrise and sundown. Nobody called it a recipe. It was just what you ate when there was nothing else to eat. Number 23. Arroz rojo. Long grain rice fried in a little oil with tomato paste, garlic, and a cube of bouillon dissolved in hot water. The rice came out a deep reddish orange and filled the kitchen with a smell that announced dinner. A 5-pound bag could last 2 weeks if the portions were measured carefully. Mexican families in East Los Angeles, in Tucson, in the colonias of the Rio Grande Valley, all cooked some form of this, and it appeared next to nearly everything else on the table. The key was toasting the rice in the oil long enough for each grain to stay separate instead of clumping together. Arroz rojo was never the main event. It was the filler that made a small piece of meat or a single scoop of beans feel like a complete plate. Number 22. Huevos rancheros. 2 fried eggs laid flat on a warm corn tortilla and covered in a sauce made from roasted tomatoes, onion, and serrano chile. The sauce blistered on the comal first, then went into the molcajete and came out rough, chunky, still hot from the stone. In the 1950s, eggs were one of the few protein sources a family could afford every single day. A dozen cost almost nothing at the corner tienda, and many families in South Texas kept their own hens in the backyard. The dish took less than 10 minutes. The tortilla soaked up the sauce from beneath, and the yolk ran into everything when you broke it with a fork. Refried beans went alongside, and sometimes a few slices of avocado if the tree in the yard had produced that week. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all at once. Number 21. Papas con huevo. Diced potatoes fried in oil until the edges turned golden, then 2 or 3 eggs cracked directly into the pan and scrambled together with the potatoes. A pinch of salt, maybe a spoonful of salsa on top. This was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on the day and how much else was in the kitchen. Potatoes were one of the cheapest things available at any market, and eggs were often bartered from a neighbor who kept chickens in the yard. Together, the 2 ingredients made a dish that was filling, fast, and required nothing else. In the barrios of Phoenix and San Antonio, papas con huevo showed up at the table several times a week. Children grew up eating it so often that the smell of potatoes crisping in oil became the first sound of morning. Number 20. Birria. A deep, rust-colored stew made from goat meat or beef that had been marinated in a paste of dried guajillo, ancho, and morita chiles, mixed with cumin, oregano, cloves, and black pepper. The meat went into a covered pot and cooked low and slow for hours until the fibers pulled apart at the lightest touch. The broth that gathered beneath was rich with rendered fat and chili oils, a liquid so concentrated in flavor that families ladled it into small cups and drank it on its own. Birria came from Jalisco, but by the 1950s it had followed Mexican families into every barrio in Southern California, from Boyle Heights to San Bernardino. In East Los Angeles, weekend mornings in the Colonia carried the smell of that chili paste hitting a hot Dutch oven before sunrise. The dish was not fast. A proper birria took a full night of marinating and a full morning of cooking. But the cuts it used were among the cheapest a family could find. Goat meat, when available, cost a fraction of what Anglo grocery stores charged for beef roasts, and when goat was not around, families used beef cheeks, shanks, or chuck, all tough cuts that needed time but rewarded patience. A single batch served a dozen people with tortillas, chopped onion, cilantro, and a squeeze of lime. The consomme on the side was poured over everything or sipped between bites to keep the warmth going. In many households, birria appeared only on Sundays and holidays, but in the poorest families, the ones stretching every cut to its limit, it showed up whenever someone found the right meat at the right price. The pot sat on the stove all day, and anyone who walked through the door got a bowl. Number 19. Nopalitos con huevo. Cactus paddles scraped clean of their thorns, diced into small strips, and cooked down with scrambled eggs. The nopal grew wild across the desert southwest, and in the yards of families who had brought cuttings north from Mexico. The pads had a slightly tart, almost green bean flavor, and released a sticky sap when cut that cooked off in the pan. There was no grocery cost when the cactus grew in your own yard. Families sliced the pads fresh every morning. In the 1950s, most non-Mexican Americans had never seen anyone eat a cactus, and the idea struck them as strange. But the plant was abundant, nutritious, and free. Mexican mothers in Tucson and the Rio Grande Valley added it to eggs, stirred it into soups, or grilled the whole pads, and ate them with salsa and a warm tortilla. Number 18. Caldo de pollo. When a laying hen stopped producing eggs, she went straight into the pot. Mexican families in the 1950s bought whole birds, sometimes bartered from a neighbor down the road, and simmered them with carrots, potatoes, chayote, and a few stalks of celery until the broth turned golden and the meat slid off the bone. Nobody separated breasts from thighs. The whole animal went in, feet included if the butcher left them on, because the collagen from the joints thickened the liquid into something that coated a spoon. Each bowl got a chunk of potato, a piece of chicken, and enough warm broth to fill a grown man twice over. Lime wedges and chopped cilantro went on top at the table. Warm tortillas on the side soaked up whatever was left. In neighborhoods across South Texas and the Central Valley, this was the first meal that appeared when someone ran a fever or the temperature dropped below freezing. One bird, one pot, 8 people fed. Most of these meals never appeared in any cookbook published in the United States during the 1950s. They were not considered cuisine. They were considered evidence of poverty. But inside the kitchens where they were made, nobody confused economy with inferiority. A woman who could feed 8 people with a single chicken and a bag of rice was not struggling. She was solving a problem that most professional chefs never had to face. Number 17. Frijoles refritos. A pot of pinto beans cooked the day before, scooped into a hot skillet with a generous spoonful of lard, and mashed flat with the back of a wooden spoon. The beans hissed and popped as the moisture cooked off, and the lard pulled them into a thick, creamy paste that spread across a tortilla like butter. This was the single most consumed food in Mexican households across the Southwest in the 1950s. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and everything in between. A pound of dried beans expanded to several times its weight when cooked, And a family of 6 could eat refried beans at every meal for 3 days straight from a single bag. Mothers fried them until the edges of the pan turned crispy and dark. That crust was the best part, and children scraped it off the bottom with a torn piece of tortilla before anyone else could reach it. Number 16. Camote asado. A sweet potato pushed directly into the coals of a wood stove or wrapped in foil and buried in the ashes. The skin blackened and cracked, and the inside turned into a soft, almost caramel-colored paste that was sweet without any added sugar. In the colonias along the border, camote was a common afternoon snack for children who came home hungry. The sweet potatoes were cheap at any outdoor market, and they required no preparation beyond heat and time. Some families sprinkled a little cinnamon on top. Others squeezed lime juice over the flesh, which cut the sweetness and added a sharp, clean bite. A single camote could keep a child satisfied for hours, and in a household where dinner was still a long way off, that mattered more than anything on a plate. Number 15. Gorditas de masa. Thick rounds of corn masa pinched up at the edges to form a shallow cup, then fried in lard until the outside was crisp and the inside stayed soft. The filling was whatever happened to be available: beans, a little crumbled cheese, shredded meat if there was any left over from the day before. Most of the time, the gordita itself was the meal, filled only with beans and a spoon of salsa. The word gordita means little fat one, and the name described the shape perfectly: short, thick, and heavy in the hand. In the 1950s, women in Monterey origin communities in San Antonio and Corpus Christi made them on flat griddles, pressing each one by hand. Street vendors sold them outside churches after Sunday Mass for a few cents apiece, and factory workers carried them wrapped in cloth to eat during breaks. Number 14. Chilaquiles. Stale tortillas torn into rough triangles and fried in oil until they stiffened, then dropped into a pot of simmered salsa, red or green, and stirred until the chips softened and the sauce thickened around them. A fried egg went on top, or a scoop of crumbled queso fresco, or nothing at all. Chilaquiles were the original zero-waste breakfast. The dish existed because tortillas went stale every day, and throwing food away was never an option. A stack of leftover tortillas from the night before became the next morning's meal without any additional cost. In the 1950s, families across the Mexican barrios of the Southwest ate chilaquiles several mornings a week. The dish required no fresh ingredients beyond the salsa, which was often made in bulk at the start of the week and kept in a covered clay pot on the counter. The texture was everything. The tortilla pieces absorbed the sauce but held just enough resistance to give each bite a slight chew. When the chips sat too long, they dissolved into a soft, almost porridge-like consistency that was its own version of the dish. Some families preferred that softer version. Others pulled the pan off the heat early to keep the edges crisp. Both approaches were correct, and the preference was inherited within each household like any other family opinion. In East Los Angeles, chilaquiles were sold from small storefronts along Whittier Boulevard and First Street. Workers stopped in before a shift and ate a plate standing at the counter with a cup of coffee. In San Antonio, the dish was a fixture of every weekend morning. The kitchen smelled like dried chilies and hot oil, and nobody needed to ask what was for breakfast. Number 13. Enfrijoladas. Corn tortillas dipped in a thin bean sauce, folded in half or rolled, and arranged on a plate with crumbled cheese and a drizzle of cream on top. The sauce was made by blending cooked beans with their own liquid until smooth, then warming it in a pan. The result looked like enchiladas but tasted entirely different, earthier and denser, with the full weight of the beans in every bite. The dish used the same ingredients most families already had on hand: tortillas, beans, and a little cheese. In the farming communities of the San Joaquin Valley and the neighborhoods of South Phoenix, enfrijoladas showed up on tables where enchilada sauce was too expensive or too time-consuming to prepare. The bean sauce was faster and cheaper and required only one pot. Children who grew up eating enfrijoladas often did not hear the actual name until they were adults. At home, it was just called dinner. Number 12. Atole. A warm, thick drink made from masa harina dissolved in water or milk, sweetened with piloncillo or a little cinnamon, and stirred constantly over low heat until it reached the consistency of thin porridge. Atole was breakfast in a cup. Mexican families in the 1950s drank it every morning with a piece of bread or a leftover tortilla. The masa gave it body, and the sweetness made it appealing to children who might refuse to eat anything else before school. A batch required almost nothing: a few tablespoons of masa, water, and a piece of raw sugar. In cooler months, families in the barrios of Denver and Chicago drank it to stay warm before heading out to work. The drink predated any European recipe by centuries and had sustained people across Mexico long before anyone brought it north across the border. None of these dishes came with measurements. The proportions lived in the hands of the person cooking. A handful of this, a pinch of that, enough water to cover the beans by 2 fingers. That kind of knowledge does not survive in cookbooks. It survives in kitchens, passed from one pair of hands to the next. When that chain breaks, the dish does not vanish. It just stops tasting right. Number 11. Soaps. Thick rounds of corn masa pinched up at the edges to form a shallow cup, fried until the bottom crisped, then filled with refried beans, crumbled cheese, shredded lettuce, and a drizzle of salsa. The masa was the same dough used for tortillas, but shaped thicker and smaller, pressed by hand into discs about the size of a palm. The pinched rim kept everything from sliding off. In the border towns along the Rio Grande during the 1950s, soaps were the meal mothers made when tortillas alone were not enough, but there was no money for meat. The beans did the work. The cheese was whatever crumbling queso fresco the tienda had. The whole thing came together in minutes and could be eaten standing up, held in one hand, nothing spilling. Children ate them after school. Fathers ate them before a night shift. The masa was the plate and the meal at the same time. Number 10. Molites. A bolillo, the crusty white bread roll found in every Mexican bakery, sliced in half, spread with refried beans, topped with a layer of shredded cheese, and placed under a broiler or face down on a hot comal until the cheese melted. The combination was simple and filling. Bolillos were cheap at the panaderia, and the beans were already made from the day before. In the 1950s, molites were an after-school snack, a quick lunch, or a stand-in for dinner when the week's grocery money had been spent. The bread had a firm crust that held up under the weight of the beans, and the melted cheese pulled everything together into something that felt more substantial than the sum of its parts. Families in Ciudad Juarez, El Paso, and Tucson ate them so frequently that the dish barely registered as a proper meal. Number 9. Machaca con huevo, dried beef, pounded and shredded into thin fibers, rehydrated in a hot skillet with a little oil, then scrambled with eggs, diced tomato, onion, and strips of green chile. The result was one of the most intensely flavored breakfasts in the Mexican kitchen. Machaca was originally a preservation method. Beef was salted and dried in the open air of the Sonoran Desert, where the heat and low humidity could cure a strip of meat in a matter of days. Once dried, the beef lasted for months without refrigeration. In the 1950s, families across the border towns of Arizona, New Mexico, and West Texas still made machaca at home. A single piece of dried beef, which weighed almost nothing, expanded in the pan and combined with eggs to create a dish that could feed a full table. The flavor was concentrated and slightly salty, with a chewiness that fresh beef could never replicate. The shredding was done by hand, pulling the dried strips apart until the fibers separated into something that looked like coarse thread. That texture was the signature of the dish. When the shredded meat hit the hot oil, it softened just enough to blend with the eggs without losing its bite. Butchers in Tucson and Nogales sold dried beef by the strip, and a few strips went a long way. The cost was low because the drying process used cuts that were too tough or too lean to sell fresh. Machaca con huevo was a way of turning the least desirable piece of beef into the most satisfying meal of the day. The families who made it understood that the value of meat had nothing to do with tenderness. Number 8. Lengua en salsa verde. Beef tongue, boiled for several hours until the outer skin peeled away in sheets, then sliced into rounds and simmered in a green salsa made from tomatillos, serrano chilies, and garlic. The meat underneath the skin was tender, fine-grained, and surprisingly mild. Most people who tasted it without knowing what it was assumed they were eating a slow-cooked roast. In the 1950s, tongue was one of the cheapest cuts at the butcher counter because most Anglo customers refused to buy it. Mexican families knew exactly what to do with it. The long boiling time was the only real obstacle, but in a household where the stove ran all day anyway, time was free. A single tongue fed a family of 6 with leftovers for the next day, and the salsa verde added a brightness and heat that cut through the richness of the meat. Number 7. Capirotada. A bread pudding made from stale bolillo rolls layered with piloncillo syrup, cinnamon, cloves, sliced bananas, peanuts, and raisins, then baked until the top turned dark and sticky. The piloncillo, a cone of unrefined cane sugar, was melted in water with a cinnamon stick until it became a thick amber syrup that soaked into every layer of bread. Families across the Southwest made this during Lent, when meat was off the table and sweetness became the reward. The bread was always stale, never fresh, because the whole point was using what had dried out and would otherwise go to waste. In the barrios of San Antonio and El Paso, capirotada appeared in kitchens every Friday for 6 weeks straight. Some families added a layer of cheese which melted into the syrup and created a salty pull against all that sweetness. The dish was dense, heavy, and meant to fill the gap that meat left behind. Number 6. Caldo de res, beef shank or short ribs simmered in water with chunks of corn on the cob, whole potatoes, carrots, cabbage wedges, and a handful of cilantro. The broth pulled its flavor from the bones over a slow afternoon simmer. The meat fell apart by the time the pot was ready, and the marrow dissolved into the liquid, giving it a richness that no amount of seasoning alone could match. In the 1950s, beef shank and short ribs were cheap because they required long cooking that most American home cooks were not willing to invest. Mexican families bought them by the pound at barrio butcher shops throughout the Southwest. A single pot of caldo de res fed a family for 2 meals, lunch and supper, with broth left over for the next morning. The vegetables did most of the heavy lifting, and the bone did the rest. There is a reason these meals lasted. Not nostalgia, not tradition for its own sake, but mathematics. A family earning a few dollars a day in the 1950s had to extract the maximum number of calories from the minimum number of ingredients. Every dish here is a solved equation. The variables were beans, corn, dried chilies, lard, and whatever cut of meat the rest of the market had rejected. The answers fed millions of people. Number 5. Chicharrones in salsa roja. Pork skin was the cheapest thing at the carniceria because most people walked right past it. The butcher sold it for almost nothing and sometimes gave it away. You fried the pieces in their own rendered fat until they puffed and turned golden, then broke them into rough chunks and dropped them into a simmering pot of dried guajillo and ancho chiles that had been toasted, soaked, and blended with garlic and a little cumin. The chicharrones softened in that sauce, soaking it up like a sponge, but kept a faint chew at the center that gave every bite something to work against. Families in the colonias outside Laredo and Eagle Pass ate this 2 or 3 nights a week during the 1950s because the entire pot cost next to nothing and fed everyone at the table. You tore off a piece of tortilla, scooped up a chunk of chicharron, heavy with red sauce, and that was dinner. The smell of those guajillos toasting on the comal carried through the screen door and down the street. Neighbors knew exactly what was cooking. Number 4. Rajas con crema, strips of roasted poblano chile, cooked in a skillet with onion, garlic, and a pour of Mexican crema until the whole thing turned into a soft, smoky tangle of green and white. The poblanos went onto an open flame first, held with tongs over the burner until the skin blistered and blackened, then wrapped in a damp towel to steam. The charred skin peeled off in strips, and what remained was the tender dark green flesh with a mild heat and a flavor that tasted like it had been smoked for hours. Sliced into ribbons and slow-cooked in crema, the chilies softened further and the sauce thickened around them. Families ate rajas with warm tortillas, spooning the mixture onto each one and rolling it up. In the colonias of South Texas during the 1950s, this was a meal that required no meat at all. A few poblanos from the garden, a cup of crema, and a stack of tortillas made dinner for a full table. Some families stirred in kernels of corn or folded the rajas into quesadillas with a little melted cheese. Number 3. Tripas. Beef or pork intestines, cleaned thoroughly and boiled until tender, then fried in their own rendered fat on a flat griddle until the edges turned crisp and golden brown. The smell was strong, sharp, and unmistakable. When someone was frying tripas, the whole block knew about it. Most Americans in the 1950s would not consider eating intestines under any circumstance, but Mexican families, particularly those from rural backgrounds, treated them as one of the most versatile and rewarding cuts available. The intestines were practically free at most butcher counters, given away or sold for almost nothing because no one else asked for them. Once fried, the texture was chewy on the inside and crunchy on the outside, somewhere between pork rinds and crispy bacon. Tripa were served in tacos with salsa verde and chopped raw onion, or eaten straight off the griddle with a squeeze of lime. Cleaning them was the real work, and the willingness to do that work was what separated the families who ate well from the families who went without. Number 2. Papas con chorizo. Diced potatoes fried with crumbled Mexican chorizo, the soft, vinegar and chile-seasoned pork sausage that stained everything it touched a deep reddish orange. The fat from the chorizo rendered out first, and the potatoes cooked in it, absorbing the color and the heat until every piece was coated. The combination was served in tacos, rolled in warm tortillas, or eaten straight from the skillet with a spoon. Chorizo was cheap in every Mexican market in the Southwest. A single link went far because its flavor was so concentrated that a small amount seasoned an entire pan of potatoes. In the 1950s, papas con chorizo was a weekend breakfast in most families, the kind of meal that filled the house with the smell of spiced pork fat and let everyone know the day had started properly. The dish required no instruction beyond watching someone else make it once. Number 1. Frijoles de olla. A clay pot filled with dried pinto beans, water, a clove of garlic, a piece of onion, and a branch of epazote if it grew in the yard. The pot went on the stove in the morning and simmered all day, filling the house with a smell that was more atmosphere than aroma, something low and warm that settled into the walls. By evening, the beans were soft and the broth had turned thick and silky. No meat, no oil, no spice beyond the garlic and the herb. In the 1950s, frijoles de olla was the meal beneath every other meal on this list. Beans showed up at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were eaten from a bowl with a tortilla, spooned over rice, mashed and refried for the next morning, or stirred into soups to stretch them further. A single pot lasted days. The nutritional return was enormous, and a bag of dried pintos was one of the cheapest things a family could buy. Every household represented here, no matter how little they had, started with this pot on the stove. The bean pot was not a last resort. It was the foundation that made everything else on this list possible. The women who cooked these meals never wrote a single recipe down, and they never needed to. If any of these dishes were part of your family's table, leave a comment and tell us which one you remember most.